From Redox and Healthcare Strategy Bullpen, welcome to Diagnosing Healthtech.
So let me answer this in two ways. The first is solve a real business problem. So when you go speak to CEOs of hospitals and you say, would you like an algorithm? Typically what they'll say is, I can't even spell that. They'll say, I have negative margins, my clinicians are burned out, and I can't hire and retain specialists. You say, well, if those are your three business problems, what if there were tools that could help with all three? Oh, well, that would be wonderful. And so that's the way we start to demonstrate value. What Mayo has done is created, and I'm of course not here to sell anyone anything, but we've created an early disease diagnosis AI starter pack that we are placing in community hospitals to demonstrate the capabilities of AI to solve real business problems. Because then once they see that, then they say, this is actually real. This is not just some blockchain next generation hype, right? So that's really important. But another question to ask is, in 2030, knowing what you know about our industry, do you think heads in beds, fee for service, is going to be the way that hospitals thrive? How about more mergers and acquisitions? The answer is no. Right? The future is going to be the organizations that are delivering in non-traditional settings, novel digital services, creating new marketplaces. So the savvy CEO will say, God, this is existential. Unless I do this now, in 2030, I will not be competitive.
When I talk about the need to be doing digital and AI upskilling, it starts with the C-suite. And again, Gartner and others point out that, you can be a great leader that's been very successful up to this point. If you believe in AI and digital transformation, being a leader in that new realm requires new hard and soft skills. And so your ability to think you're going to have the same skills as a leader to be successful going forward, it's not the same. So I've had this conversation with C-suite leaders before. I love asking CEOs, what's your role in AI? And oftentimes the answer starts with, well, I've hired the best CTO I can find. I've let the budget committee know that this is a priority. When I hear that, that tells me, no, they don't get it. The CEO is responsible for things like setting the vision. The person that really helps start driving a different culture. That inclusivity of saying, on my blue ribbon panel, I've got 2 physicians out of 20, but I've got 2,000 physicians on staff with privileges. It's how do you bring those other physicians along? And many times.
That comment sort of came actually from a conversation with UPMC's CEO, Leslie Davis. We had gotten onto the topic of artificial intelligence and talking about creating governance for our healthcare system. And I reflected on a few other sort of technologies that were emerging into healthcare. One experience I had related to sort of, virtual imaging devices with goggles, that there seem to be almost more companies out there than surgical specialties, and they're all sort of pushing their platform. And as I thought about this in a broad sense, not just for generative AI, but for AI in general, if we didn't bring it into the organization in a thoughtful manner, that there was so much hype out there that you could spend $50 or $100 million and not have any practical improvement in either efficiency or care delivery within your organization. And that's what really sparked the conversation about creating a governance infrastructure, which is still an evolving conversation here. But I think it's at least allowed many of our leaders to sort of pump the brakes a little bit and be a little bit more contemplative as we think about how artificial intelligence could enhance care delivery.
coordination of data in healthcare has been almost ready for prime time for 20 years. The challenge with high tech is it said, let's digitize medicine. Well, we did. I mean, in the sense that we went from recording the information on paper to recording the information digitally, but we didn't give the clinicians anything back. So they spent hours and hours at their keyboards dutifully entering problems and meds and allergies, typing in notes, and then what? And so, of course, that's the question, which is if you want to give them something back, turn this from an administrative burden into an essential companion and tool, what are some of the things you need to do? Well, first would be we want to turn the data into wisdom. A lot of the data that we gather in healthcare isn't very good. It's messy. And there are huge issues of secondary use, privacy constraints, and regulatory and sub-regulatory guidance. And so one has to take the data, realize you can put it in a standard form, and that standard form has to be curated. So people don't live to 150 typically. Typically, people don't have 3 kidneys removed, right? So you have to clean it. And then once you've created this large corpus of data, then you ready it for collaboration with industry, small companies, large companies, other academic medical centers, to create novel products and services without selling the data, without for a moment exfiltrating it or potentially compromising a patient's preference for the use of their data. So much of what this last couple of years has been is this evolution from the dumb container of data to now the highly useful products and services that come out with AI models that we've validated.
There are starting to, as many of our audience knows, there are many companies that are generating algorithms. And so we'll contemplate sort of the non-generative, but sort of traditional, what I would say more traditional artificial intelligence. And I think it's very clear that regardless of how good someone's existing algorithm is, it still needs to be localized to the patient population or your population that you're delivering care to. For example, I have some very knowledgeable, inventive colleagues here. We have our own sort of homegrown risk of readmission score that we've embedded within our electronic health records. When we compared with some of the scores that are in the public domain, it was clear that the generation and localization of our score based on our patients provided higher value in being instructing and guidance and care delivery than those that you might get a little bit more off the shelf. And so that really pointed to the value of, even though someone shows you a score that has high predictive value, for example, it still needs to be tuned to your patient population, and you have to adjudicate whether that predictive value still persists.
But it's really important that once you develop and validate a model, you put it back into workflow. No clinician is going to launch a separate app or a separate website. They're going to want to be in the middle of the EHR, push a button, and have magic happen. And let me give you a quick example. So we have hundreds of millions of ECGs, 12 lead, 6 lead, 1 lead. And we've got now 14 models developed on those ECGs, some in FDA 510K approval now. And they can do things like predict disease you don't yet have. And so what we do for every patient that gets an ECG at Mayo, you click a button in Epic, and it runs the 14 algorithms on the ECG and shows you these likelihoods of disease states. It's not diagnostic. I mean, this is really more educational and differential and that kind of thing. But the point being is there's zero burden to getting this AI insight in workflow, even though the models were developed outside the EHR itself.
I come from a trade of technology and neuroscience generally, and I'm generally quite excited when I see something new or some new capacity. But more often than not, I find that these new capacities don't land in the office of the doctor. And the reason for this is that there's a series of critical steps that are missing in delivering that piece of technology. We kind of stay on what's great and interesting, and sometimes omit what is actually useful. And what is useful is not always what is interesting from an AI or overarching technology standpoint. So I can give you an example, and I made that point in that paper, which is about practicality. Say you create, a wonderful algorithm that can start mapping all the synapses that you find in the brain, and that's some work that's been done in the research side of the community. What you find that even if you were to get to something that's actually, let's say, meaningful in terms of mapping something you're interested to map in the brain, you're looking at a lot of connections for really big insights. So you might have a translation issue here, but nevertheless, let's assume you do so. Once you release that system and you're getting to bring it to doctors, you also have to consider the systems that the doctors are working on. And if you've ever been into your doctor's office, you can see that they less often than you think of benefit of the latest technology when it comes to computers. It's often, a good few years old laptops and so on and so forth. So having your system working on that, be it doing amazing things, you'll fall far short of your promise. And that's just one of the many examples by which great systems, great engineering actually never properly lands in the hands of doctors and ultimately never get to patients and deliver the impact they need.
I was asked on stage a couple of months ago by someone. They started their question by saying something like, "Well, we all know physicians are change resistant." And before she could even finish the question, I stopped her because I didn't want to be embarrassed by answering her question. And it's like, here's the thing: physicians are as human as anyone, believe it or not. And like anyone, when they see something that they don't understand and they're not being included in, they drive home like all of us saying, well, what does this mean to me? And if we're not bringing physicians and everyone along, and they're asking that question of what does it mean to me? And they're reading all of the things in the lay press and the professional journals about how first we're all going to lose our jobs and then we're probably going to be enslaved by AI. I mean, it's no wonder that people are resistant. Which brings me back to, part of that digital upskilling is bringing everyone along, starting with educating them on what AI is, how it eventually can be used to not only be a threat, but actually be a tool to, again, free them up from the repetitive activities. I love Eric Topol, who many people know, head of Scripps Research, author of a really great book, Deep Medicine. He termed the phrase keyboard liberation. I mean, when you look at what we've done to clinicians, they went to medical school or nursing school and we're turning them into data entry clerks. So our ability to start moving in that direction, but having people understand that in the end, it is going to impact how they work, but hopefully it's going to make them better at what they do. There's another study that just came out from Science Magazine where they really a good evidentiary test a simple test where they had about 500 knowledge workers, half were given GPT. They were all given the same writing and knowledge tasks. And the study reported not only, those using generative AI were far more productive, but it also reported that those using it and their ability to do work faster and be more efficient actually gave them greater job satisfaction. So those are the things I look at and say, done right. I believe instead of the existential threat, we should be talking about the existential opportunity to engage everyone in moving healthcare to a much higher ground than we are today.
Clinically, I'm a pediatric intensivist, and there are pediatric risk of injury and mortality scores that and algorithms that are very traditional old school algorithms that I've been using in clinical care for nearly 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's a cohort of my colleagues that weren't as adoptive of traditional risk in scores. There are people that feel that they don't necessarily add particular value to their ability to deliver care with an individual patient. If you in that realm are traditionally averse to old school inductive sort of logic types of scoring, you're similarly going to be averse to artificial intelligence driven algorithms and scores.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think it has to do with, it's not just your comfort and belief in artificial intelligence, but it's also your belief in some of the more traditional algorithms that people have used throughout healthcare in general. I do think that as artificial intelligence becomes more and more of what occurs in daily life, and it's like many things, right? We're going to see it in other aspects of our lives. San Francisco has now got two companies that have the self-driving cars that they've greenlit, right? And so as you start seeing that in other aspects of your life, I do think, and you see it being successful, I think that will also infuse the ability to use artificial intelligence in a much more applicable manner within healthcare. There will be a point, and I don't know if it's not 1 year from now, but there'll be a point 5 or 10 years from now where I think the physicians who embrace and engage and adopt artificial intelligence into how they deliver care, not necessarily how it drives them, maybe in more of a co-pilot type of a process, right? Something that is they bring in and contemplate within their decision making and allow them to either make a decision faster or allow them to have a broader differential diagnosis than they initially would have had themselves. I think you're going to see those physicians thrive and potentially be more successful than those who sort of turn a cold shoulder to that type of technology coming into healthcare. But it's going to take time, and part of that time is developing trust in it.
So Jeff asks probably the most important question of the day, which is, in any change management or any innovation activity, there is technology, policy, and psychology. And you're talking about the human factor, the behavior. So imagine this. I say, hey, doctor, let me show you 200 metrics of sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value, showing that this model is fair, appropriate, valid, equitable, and safe. They will look at it and say, that mathematically might be true, but it doesn't mean it's credible. I need more than just math. And so what if I said this? We did a randomized clinical trial. This is all true, by the way. And in that randomized clinical trial, we were able to diagnose patients 20% faster. We were able to have doctors get home an hour earlier. We were able to diagnose colon cancer at a much earlier stage. So you suddenly describe the clinical relevance, the clinical impact, and it's validated using a gold standard like an RCT. And then they say, oh, now that sensitivity and specificity means something to me.
I think there's sort of potentially three drivers. One is truly, if you have a more efficient healthcare system, you probably have a system that has more effectively managed the cost of care delivery, and therefore financial improvement is an opportunity there. So that's one driver. The other, like the stroke imaging example algorithm I mentioned, that one is trying to have more efficient or improvement in clinical decisions and aiding in that process. And so that's really more a direction in trying to define an improvement in care delivery. And I think that ultimately is going to be a larger component as more of the clinical care side part of healthcare systems becomes more and more comfortable. And I think also there's more oversight and guidance on those types of algorithms used there. And then the third component, and Jeff brought up generative AI at the beginning, which most of us are, think about in the speech conversational space. And the third component there is probably, what are those types of intelligent solutions that might improve the efficiency of a physician or an APP or a specific clinician in the process they're doing? And in that case, it's not necessarily about more efficiency and throughput, but it's potentially decreasing the burden of technology on a clinician in the care delivery process. Because I think one of the things, some of the best technologies, and I'm actually blanking on an example right now, but I mean, are become really invisible in the use of that technology. And I think some of the generative AI in the voice documentation space, where if I'm the physician and Jeff is the patient in front of me, that technology veil or barrier between us starts to dissolve, because the conversation becomes the root of the documentation that I need for the care that I've delivered to Jeff.
You mean like a nuance ambient clinical solutions, Rob? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. So Nuance Ambient is one of them. There's another company called Bridge that is in that space. But those are the types of solutions where there is a benefit to operational efficiency, but there's also a benefit in decreasing effort, and that may translate into decreasing physician burnout or improving physician wellness, right, in the care delivery process, because I think a lot of technology has added a little bit of administrative burden to all of us in the care delivery process. And this is a way of eliminating some of that.
You know, when I look at it, AI in general is a toolbox. And then the example I make is when that toolbox is specifically applied to medicine. But I think some of the learnings that I share there can be applied across the board in other fields. And in the field of medicine in general, there's a lot of activities that needs to be done, but two more specifically where AI can be useful. One of which is diagnostic. And diagnostic is something we've seen a lot of in terms of AI systems enabling that, and more specifically, streamlining processes in the past few years. So typical AI systems we see now in the field is you have a radiologist, for instance, that has, several hundreds of scans to go through in a day. And then there's a flagging system that says, well, this one might be fine, and this one you probably want to have a second look. And this is extremely helpful when you have a large amount of information and then you need to go through it with a limited amount of time. That's one part where the diagnostic, powered AI can be found most often in doctor's office. The second part is about treatment. And this is not so much about streamlining a set of operations or automating a set of operations. This is about reducing bias. So when you think about the case you've got at hand, you've got a patient in front of you. Well, that patient is connected to a wide array of information. You've got all the tests that have been ran, the scans that are available, the blood test, the measurement, but also things like family history and the latest, advances in genetics that you need to be aware. There's a lot of information, and all that information needs to collide in a single point. And that single point is what the doctors have in front of them so that they can make a decision or a set of constrained decisions for a treatment plan. And in here, the approach is a little bit different. It's reducing all that complexity to enable less biased and more encompassing treatment options.
And you need a team that's nimble and has a good clinical understanding of the data that you're trying to interrogate and utilize. Make sure they have access to it, understand the provenance of the data, because that's important. And then be able to then run those algorithms, whether you create it or you acquire it or borrow it, be able to then run it with your own data set so that you can compare it and tune it to your environment. So it's not just as easy as I have an algorithm, I need to go test it. You actually have to have, I think, a pretty solid group of data scientists who can help you with the clinical analytics and really understanding the data that goes into helping localize that specific algorithm.
Practicality is important because you can create an amazing piece of engineering. That piece of engineering will be no good if never anyone uses it. So you have to make sure that your user can access it and find a use for it in their practices. And I think that's important. I can take the example of surgery and more specifically, neurosurgery, which I've been, trying to help for the past few years. And what you find is that these procedures are extremely complex. And when we say procedure, there's a set of steps that needs to happen from the initial, meeting the patient all the way to post-surgery and follow-up. These steps needs to be put in a certain order. And so when you're introducing a new system in a procedure, that procedure needs to be adapted to account for that new system. Say, speaking of my company, we do brain mapping. And so you're introducing now in a neurosurgical workflow a map of the brain where before there was only a scan. Okay, well, that's very useful, but where does that sit in the doctor's, planning, and where does that sit currently in surgery? So you got to think about all these things. And if you just come and say, well, here's a solution, here's a map, do it this way, you'll find that the user will withdraw and won't adopt your system. But if you say, well, here's a piece of information you can use at that point in time, and guess what? This is the moment you're on your computer, so it actually really is at hand when you're actually looking at your screen, and it's directly relevant for your case. Then suddenly you're embedding yourself into the current procedure, and therefore you're more likely to be.
Yeah, so there's a lot of Pareto analysis you're going to do. And let me just start with even in the data prep. Okay, data is structured and unstructured, but it's also telemetry. It's images, it's omics, it's digital pathology, and then it's every registry or you've probably contributed to at a departmental level since the dawn of time. What's going to give you the greatest utility? If your utility is defined as early diagnosis, novel treatment, care journeys, these kinds of things, okay, so we literally laid out 200 different data types and said, oh, we'll start with the structured and the unstructured, then we'll move to images, then telemetry, then to digital path, then to omics, then to registries. And that became a 2-year map of all the kinds of data you're going to add. And then some of the projects you're going to want to do are actually a function of what data assets are available. So for example, it's just now that we're finishing up 12 million digital pathology slides with full annotation. And so and this is actually a true story, when a company says, God, we want to develop a novel digital biomarker, and all we need is 12 million digital pathology slides, the answer is, okay, 2024. And then one question you need to ask is democratizing access to this DID data. What Mayo did is it built something called an AI factory. And let me give you some quick examples of that. AI Factory does natural language processing, has different kinds of tools. Some are code, you write PyTorch. Some are low code, some are no code. And so let's imagine one of your tens of thousands of clinicians and employees says, God, I really wonder, what are the likely signs and symptoms that lead a patient to a positive COVID test? This is something we actually did in March of 2020. Oh, is it fever, sore throat, cough? Well, that clinician discovered it was loss of taste and sense of smell by doing NLP analysis on the records in the DID data set against the laboratory results for positive COVID tests. And that literally was like done before breakfast. So, you're able to do this at very large scale across your enterprise. But be careful, because if you do this kind of thing and you bring in an engineer, and I love engineers, I am one, but somebody who doesn't have, say, healthcare domain expertise and say, here's a bunch of DID data, go develop a model. So I had an engineer do this. He said, oh my God, I have the best model ever. It's got an AUC of 0.99. I said, that's great. What is the model? He said, if you give high dose opioids to your inpatients, you reduce readmission rates substantially. So that would be, of course, a useless model. And he then asks, what's a palliative care unit?